say the sea chooses who lives, but that is a lie. The sea chooses no one. It only waits while men choose each other. When we captured the creature, there were still 17 of us, seasoned men, armed, convinced that anything rising from the depths could be subdued with thick ropes and enough gunpowder. It did not fight, it did not scream, it only watched, as if it already knew exactly how much time we had left. On the first night, the ship stopped, without storm, without opposing wind, without damage of any kind. It simply stopped, and that was when the creature spoke. Not to everyone, only to me. It said the ship would never reach anywhere with it aboard, and that there was a way out. Simple, horrible but simple. Take it to an inhabited island. Anyone would do. At that moment, we still believed we had a choice, but we did not. 2 men fell ill first, then died, and we learned too quickly that feeding the creature made the ship move again. We learned it together in silence, and when the time came to decide between our survival and the lives of people we would never see up close, no one stood up to say no. The village had women, it had children, and even so, everyone voted. Everyone, except one man who lied. This is not a story about a monster from the depths of the sea. The creature was only the catalyst. This is the story of how 17 men reached a consensus to commit something unforgivable, and how only 2 survived what they did afterward. If you are expecting justice, you are listening to the wrong story. Here, there is only decision, and the price of living with it. Before we continue, there is something you should know. This is not just a horror story, nor is it simply a tale about monsters at sea. It is a pirate story, about decisions made on a wet deck, about ordinary men placed in situations no chart can teach you how to avoid. On Caribbean Tales, the sea is always at the center of everything, but the stories themselves can be adventure, mystery, tragedy, or horror, sometimes all at once. Here, the ocean is not just a backdrop. It is where ambition, fear, loyalty, and survival collide. These stories do not promise comfort or fair endings. They speak of survival, of greed and broken honor, of consequences that follow a man long after he leaves the ship behind. Not every tale told here will be horror, but every one of them carries the same truth. Life at sea always demands a price. If you enjoy long, carefully narrated pirate stories, filled with tension, hard choices, and characters who do not fit neatly into heroes or villains, then this channel was made for you. If this kind of storytelling keeps you listening, consider subscribing to Caribbean Tales and leaving a like. It helps more than you might think and allows stories like this one to keep being told without rushing, without shortcuts, and without easy conclusions. Every bit of support is a sign that there are still people willing to hear stories that do not soften their edges or ask permission to be unsettling. Now adjust the volume, set aside any distractions, and prepare yourself for the journey ahead. From this point on, there will be no summaries and no safe paths. Everything that happened aboard that ship will be told, from the first mistake to the final consequence. And when we reach the end, you will understand why sometimes surviving is just another form of punishment. The day we captured the creature began like any other, with calm seas, favorable wind, and a crew too busy with routine to notice that something was wrong, until the lookout shouted about a shadow far too large to be a drifting reef, moving against the current as if it were not bound by the same rules as we were, and Captain Alaric Thorne ordered caution, but not retreat, because at sea hesitation often costs more than mistakes. When the creature surfaced partially, there was no immediate panic. It did not attack. It did not roll the hull. It simply allowed itself to be seen, revealing a colossal, irregular body covered in dark plates too ancient to have a defined shape, with deep-set eyes watching us without haste or clear threat. And some men crossed themselves while others smiled nervously, already imagining stories to sell in distant ports. And it was there, in that brief space between fear and greed, that the idea of capturing it was born. Ropes were thrown, harpoons prepared, and there was no fight, only work, because the creature allowed itself to be bound as if it understood that resisting at that moment would change nothing, which should have been the first warning, since no animal accepts captivity with such patience. Yet when it was secured beneath the hull, the crew celebrated, laughed, slapped each other on the back, and turned the unknown into a trophy before understanding what they had done. The captain watched in silence, because Alaric Thorne never celebrated victories too early, and knew the sea well enough to understand that some things are not measured by the size of the catch, but by what it does when it believes time is on its side. And even so, he authorized the containment and ordered the ship to stay on course, because at first glance there was no reason to change the plan. It was at nightfall that the ship began to slow, not abruptly, but gradually, as if it were entering denser waters, and although the sails still caught wind and the currents were favorable, our forward movement diminished. The men noticed, exchanged looks, adjusted ropes, checked the helm, everything seemingly in order, until shortly after the ship came to a complete stop, without impact, without splintering wood, only the clear and uncomfortable sensation of being motionless in open water, accompanied by an unnatural silence in which even the waves seemed to hesitate before touching the hull. And it was then that Alaric felt something different, not in his ears, but in his mind, when the creature spoke for the first time, not out loud and not to everyone, only to him, calmly stating that the ship would go no farther with it aboard, and presenting an alternative too simple to ignore and too terrible to accept. Take it to an inhabited island, anyone would do, and after that the voyage would continue normally. And while the crew murmured and searched for technical explanations for the inexplicable halt, the captain stood still, staring at the dark sea, fully aware that the nature of the voyage had changed, because they did not yet know it. But from that moment on, they were no longer sailing toward a destination. They were sailing toward a choice. In the hours that followed, the captain kept the ship in order while the crew struggled to explain the unexplainable. The helm responded, the sails filled, the currents pushed in the right direction, and still the hull remained motionless, as if something were holding it fast from below. Some men suggested excess weight, others spoke of an unseen failure, but no explanation survived a second question. Alaric Thorne listened to them all without comment. He already knew the truth, and he knew as well that revealing it too soon would help no one. The creature spoke again when the moon rose, calm and precise without urgency, repeating what it had already said as if correcting a miscalculation. The ship would go nowhere with it aboard, not as punishment, not as vengeance, but as consequence. It then offered the alternative once more, unchanged in tone, without additions, without promises beyond what was necessary. An inhabited island would resolve the matter. The ship would resume its voyage. The agreement would end there. The captain asked what would happen to the island. The creature did not answer directly. It said only that it did not make threats, it only presented outcomes, and that it did not lie. But neither did it explain what was irrelevant to the decision. That was enough for Alaric to understand there was no room for real negotiation, only for delay. On deck, the crew felt the weight of immobility settle into their bones. Stagnant water always unsettles sailors. Some began to argue in low voices. Others watched the creature with too much attention, trying to measure something that could not be measured. Elias Hale, thin and easily overlooked, kept to the edges, occupying himself with meaningless tasks, simply to avoid standing still for too long. That was when the first signs of sickness appeared. One man collapsed during his watch, feverish, complaining of pains no one could explain. Another began to delirium hours later, shifting between chills and cold sweat. Old Merrick recognized the symptoms with uncomfortable speed. It was not plague nor visible injury, but something older, something that tended to surface when ships remained too long trapped in the wrong waters. The captain noticed the correlation before anyone else did. The creature moved almost imperceptibly whenever the sick worsened. The hull creaked faintly, as if something beneath the ship were adjusting its weight. There was no certainty yet, only a pattern beginning to take shape. Alaric gathered the officers and explained the situation without revealing the full proposal. He spoke of the creature, the stagnation, and the need for time. He did not mention the island. Not yet. He needed to see how far the crew would go on their own before pushing them in any direction. That night, while the men rotated through their watches, the captain heard the creature again, this time with something close to curiosity. It said humans always took too long to accept the obvious, but when they did, they were efficient. Alaric did not answer. He was too busy watching his crew grow sick, argue, and fear. The choice had not yet been spoken aloud, but it was already forming, silent and inevitable, like a submerged current pulling everyone in the same direction. And the captain knew that when it finally surfaced, there would be no turning back. The sickness advanced too quickly to allow for illusions. The two men worsened through the night, drifting between confused delirium and brief moments of clarity in which they seemed to understand exactly what was happening, and neither asked for help, perhaps because they already knew there was none to be given. Old Merrick confirmed what the captain had already suspected. Whatever had taken them was not something cured by rest or prayer, and even if the ship began moving again, they would not survive until the next dawn. It was in that narrow space between the certainty of death and the refusal to accept it that the captain saw the correlation become impossible to ignore, because each time one of the sick men worsened, the hull creaked faintly, as if something beneath the ship were adjusting its weight. And when one of them finally stopped breathing, the ship advanced a few yards before slipping back into its previous stillness. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone felt it. And that was what made the silent decision come so quickly. The bodies were not treated as sacrifice or punishment, merely as something that no longer belonged on the deck. And when they were cast into the sea, the creature took them without haste and without visible violence, only with a slow movement that closed the water over them. The ship began to move clearly for the first time in days. The sails answered, the helm obeyed once more, and no one celebrated, because everyone understood exactly what had happened. That choice had not been made in council, nor announced aloud, but it had been accepted by all, and that was what disturbed the captain most of all, because from that moment on, the crew had learned something too dangerous to forget. Feeding the creature worked, and when something works at sea, men stop asking whether it should be done. The vote took place the following day, though in truth it had already been happening since the night before, in the averted glances, in conversations that stopped when someone approached, and in the contained relief that followed the ship's movement after the bodies had been given to the creature. Alaric did not need to suggest anything. The crew themselves brought the matter to him, first as a hypothesis, then as a proposal, and finally as something that felt too logical to argue against for long. It was Elira who recognized the nearest island on the old charts, a small, nearly forgotten settlement with no fortifications, known to be inhabited mostly by women, children, and the elderly, because the men of fighting age had left years earlier and never returned. The information landed on the deck like dead weight, and for a moment too brief to be hope, it seemed possible that someone might step back. No one did. When Alaric asked who opposed taking the creature there was no immediate response, only silence, and then one by one the men began to nod, not with enthusiasm but with resignation, like men accepting an unavoidable calculation. They did not speak of the island as people, but as distance, as a route, as something too abstract to bleed in front of them. The captain watched every face as the decision solidified, noting who spoke first, who avoided eye contact, and who seemed too relieved by the knowledge that responsibility would be shared. By the end, all had agreed, and it was then that Alaric understood he had lost the ship, because a crew united around the wrong choice is more dangerous than any creature from the depths. That was when he lied. He gathered the men again and announced that the vote had ended differently, that the majority had chosen to spare the village, and that only a single vote had been cast to sacrifice it. He accused no one outright, simply allowed the information to exist, and watched trust dissolve in real time, each man trying to remember his own vote and the votes of the others, each silence turning into suspicion. When he said he would not allow a single vote to condemn an entire settlement, the effect was immediate, because no one knew who was being protected and who was being threatened. The brute was the first to react, laughing too loudly and denying it with violence, stepping forward unasked, and that was enough. Alaric did not raise his voice, did not explain his reasoning, and did not ask for support. He simply drew his pistol and fired once, the sharp report echoing across the deck like something that could not be undone. The man fell heavily, and no one ran to help him, because in that instant everyone understood this was not about justice, but about control. The captain holstered the weapon and said only that a single vote had nearly destroyed an entire village, then walked away without looking back. The silence that followed was not shock, but calculation, because every man there realized there was no way to prove innocence, and that their collective strength had just been broken. The creature did not respond, neither approving nor objecting, but the ship moved more easily that night, as if it recognized the new order aboard. From that moment on, the decision no longer belonged to the crew, and the captain knew he had crossed a point of no return, because saving innocence had required turning every other man into a potential enemy. The night that followed the gunshot left the deck unnaturally clean, as if the wood itself were ashamed to hold the memory of a body for too long, and that was the first sign that the crew would not accept the world the captain had created, not out of any sense of justice, but out of fear of being the next name removed from the ship. Alaric Thorne did not need to hear plans to know they were being made. He could feel the way silence began to organize itself, the way small groups formed and dissolved when he passed, the way questions stopped being spoken aloud and were exchanged only through glances, fingers, and hesitation. Elias Hale, thin and forgettable, was the only one who continued to lower his head and work as if nothing had changed. But Alaric knew that was not loyalty, it was instinct. The same instinct that allows rats to survive fires because they do not try to put the flames out, they only look for the smallest crack. The captain, on the other hand, no longer had the luxury of looking for cracks. He needed to contain the fire before it consumed the entire ship, because the creature was still below, alive, waiting, and the village full of women and children still existed somewhere along their route, close enough to tempt any man seeking an easy solution, and distant enough to feel like nothing more than an abstract burden. In the hours that followed, Alaric did what he had always done best at sea. He counted resources, measured men, and calculated the worst outcome as if it were inevitable, because that was how one survived when luck finally ran out. And the worst outcome was no longer the creature, nor the bargain, nor hunger. It was a united crew, determined to remove the one man capable of preventing them from delivering innocence to the abyss with the calm efficiency of men changing the angle of a sail. He did not sleep, not because guilt haunted him, but because he knew an attack would come on the first night he appeared truly exhausted, and so he feigned exhaustion deliberately. It was a simple trap, the kind that works because desperate men cannot accept the idea that someone might already be 2 steps ahead when they believe victory is within reach. Alaric changed watch rotations without announcement, placed men who did not trust each other in charge of the same areas, distributed tasks in ways that isolated the influential, and left the undecided without clear leadership. And above all, he established an apparent routine. He would walk alone toward his cabin at a certain hour, pass through a specific stretch of deck, remain exposed for a short and predictable window. That was enough. When the first man moved from the shadows, Alaric already knew who it was by the sound of his breathing. When the second shifted, he already knew which one carried courage borrowed from fear. When the third hesitated, he understood who was there simply because following was easier than thinking. And that determined the order of their deaths, because Alaric did not need to kill everyone. He needed to destroy the possibility of a block, to break the spine of the mutiny before it could stand upright. The first fell without a cry, struck quickly, and the sound of his body hitting the deck was louder than the blow itself, making the others realize too late that this would not be many men against one, but a sequence of mistakes made by men who believed collective courage could replace preparation. It was in that instant of understanding that Alaric moved, not toward them, but away, always away, refusing to be surrounded, using the deck and the darkness as old allies. One lunged with a blade. Alaric let him waste the momentum and put him down with a short, efficient motion, without heroics and without words, because words delay, and delay kills. Within moments, the ambush ceased to be an attack and became panic, and panic is a predator as efficient as any monster of the sea. The boldest tried to press on, but they were the first to fall. The most influential attempted to give orders, but were cut short before their sentences could take shape, and those who had only followed began to retreat when they realized they were not fighting for justice or survival, but to avoid facing what they had already chosen during the vote. Alaric recognized that look instantly. He had seen it in countless men over the years, the look of someone who wants to kill another man so he does not have to look at himself. When it ended, the deck was quiet again, bodies lying in positions too undignified to be remembered with poetry, and the captain did not linger to look at them. He did not allow himself that luxury, because every second spent contemplating them was an invitation for the mind to bargain with regret, and regret would change nothing. It would only weaken his hand for the next decision. There were survivors, few of them, standing still, uncertain whether they should be grateful to be alive or terrified that they still were. Alaric offered no comfort, only orders, because at that point comfort would have been a lie. An order was the only thing that kept a ship functioning once morality had snapped in half. Elias Hale was among those left standing, trembling, his eyes fixed on the deck. Alaric noted that the man lacked both the courage to attack and the pride to demand explanations, which made him paradoxically the safest man aboard. At sea, martyrs are dangerous. At dawn, Alaric ordered the bodies dragged to the rail and forbade ceremony. Not out of cruelty, but because ceremony creates narrative and narrative creates justification. He would not allow anyone to begin shaping a story where the mutiny became heroic and he became a tyrant, because any such story would inevitably lead back to the village and the idea that innocent lives could be traded for survival. The dead were cast into the sea one by one, and the creature, wounded or not, still responded. It still took them, and the ship, as before, moved more freely, as if the abyss recognized the payment. That was when the remaining men understood the full horror of the situation. The captain was willing to feed the creature with his own crew, to prevent the crew from feeding the creature with children they had never seen. The difference between those two atrocities was thin, far too thin to bring peace. Alaric was not seeking peace. He was seeking an outcome, and that outcome required one final step, a step he had been holding in reserve since the moment he realized the creature was not there to kill, but to force choices. He explained nothing. He asked for no opinion. He offered no vote. He had already seen what votes produced when men were cornered. Instead, he worked alone in the hold for hours, away from eyes and voices, preparing a solution that did not depend on anyone's courage, but his own. When he returned to the deck, his face was unchanged, but his eyes looked as if they had crossed something that cannot be crossed without leaving part of oneself behind. The sea lay unnaturally smooth that night, too smooth, and the creature approached the hull with an uneven drag, like something enormous that had been wounded from within, but remained intelligent enough to recognize that food still existed above it. It was then that Alaric understood why the creature had survived every attempt to dominate it. It had never needed to hurry. It had always trusted that humans would eventually choose the easiest path. The first body was thrown overboard. The survivors watched, some with disgust, others with guilty relief that it was not them. The creature swallowed it without hesitation, as if it were routine, and for a brief moment, the ship seemed to breathe easier. Then the sea contracted in a way that felt wrong, not like a wave, but like an internal blow, deep and muffled, felt more through the hull than the ears. The ship shuddered hard enough to knock a man to his knees, and the water surged around the hull as if something massive had been struck from the inside. The creature reacted for the first time, not with fury, but with disorientation, churning the water in tight, erratic circles, as though it were trying to escape its own body. Before it could withdraw, the second body sank nearby, and the second impact followed, sharper and more violent, tearing the surface into broken waves and making the ship groan as if it might split apart. The men clung to ropes and railings, certain this was the end. The third followed almost immediately. When the third impact came, the sound was lower still, as if the sea itself had swallowed it, but the effect was greater. For several seconds the water seemed heavy, dark, as though something enormous were sinking without the strength to resist gravity. When the sea finally began to calm, the ship no longer carried the same drag. The helm answered with an ease that had not existed for days. The creature was alive, but too damaged to sustain the blockade. In that moment, Alaric felt its voice flood his mind again, no longer calm or precise, but fractured and irregular, as if each thought had to pass through pain before taking shape. It accused him of altering the agreement. Alaric did not answer aloud. There was no one who needed to hear. He took up his sword and went down into the hold alone, because some things can only be finished by the man who began them. Down in the hold, the water lay dark and shallow, sloshing gently against the walls as the ship moved, and the creature rose partially from it, still immense, still conscious, but no longer whole. The plates that had once made its body feel like an unbreakable wall were cracked and uneven, sections of its mass responding with a delay, as though the entire organism were still trying to understand why it was no longer invulnerable. For the first time since it had surfaced from the abyss, it did not feel inevitable. It felt surprised. Its presence pressed into Alaric's mind, asking if he truly understood what he was doing, reminding him that even wounded it would be remembered by the sea. That inevitability was not so easily undone. Alaric did not answer with arguments or philosophy. He had passed the point where explanations mattered, to monsters or to himself. He stepped forward instead, sword held steady, not like a hero charging a foe, but like a jailer closing the final door. The creature tried to move, but its body betrayed it. The explosions had done more than wound flesh. They had broken certainty, opening weaknesses where none had existed before. Alaric found space where he expected resistance, felt the blade slide into a path that had not been there days earlier. He drove the sword forward with everything he had left, aiming not with knowledge of anatomy, but with the intuition of a man who had spent too many nights staring at impossible choices. There was resistance for a brief moment, pressure too great to be called flesh and too complex to be stone, and then it gave way. The creature shuddered, releasing a low, deep sound that was neither pain nor rage, but something closer to disbelief. The water around it surged once, violently, then began to settle. The weight beneath the ship vanished. The creature did not thrash. It did not dissolve. It simply stopped. Alaric remained there for several seconds, breathing hard, his hand still locked around the hilt of the sword, feeling no triumph, only confirmation. When he finally pulled the blade free, the water was calm again, and the oppressive presence that had pressed against his thoughts was gone. The hold felt empty in a way that could not be mistaken. He climbed back to the deck alone. The night air felt ordinary, almost offensive in its normality. The wind was real, the stars steady, the ship answering the helm as it should. The abyss had released them, but not forgiven them. Only Elias Hale waited for him, standing uncertainly near the rail, not out of courage, but because he did not know where else to go. His eyes were wide, like those of a man who had survived a fire by hiding, and now stared at the ashes without knowing whether to feel shame or relief. The ship sailed on, free of the creature, yet heavier than it had ever been. Alaric looked toward the horizon and understood that they would reach a port, that the hull could be repainted, new men hired, stories shortened and softened. From the outside, the voyage might one day seem unremarkable, but inside him, it would always be the journey where 17 men voted to sacrifice innocence, and only stopped when one man lied and put a weapon into the equation. Elias opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to thank him, perhaps to ask a question, but the words died before they became sound. Alaric did not demand them. Gratitude and questions were only ways to ease a conscience, and neither of them had one left to ease. They stood side by side as dawn began to creep over the water, two small figures on a wide deck surrounded by sea. Alaric understood the final irony then. He had killed a monster from the depths, but the monster that mattered had been the collective decision. The calm way starving men turned distant lives into numbers. That monster was still alive, because it lived in every crew, every port, every man who chose survival over goodness. The sun rose fully. Alaric gave simple orders to trim the sails and hold course. Elias obeyed with trembling hands. The ship moved on, finally free of the abyss, but never free of what had been done. And Alaric Thorne, still alive, understood that survival was not a reward. It was a sentence, and the sea in the end did not choose who lived. It only watched who was able to keep sailing after paying the price. The ship sailed on as if nothing had happened, and that was the first thing that truly unsettled Alaric Thorne after the creature's death. The wind was steady, the sails obeyed, the helm responded with precision, and the hull cut through the water with the ease of any ordinary voyage. There was no trace of the invisible weight that had dragged them for days, no pressure beneath the ship like a patient hand. The sea had returned to normal far too quickly, as if it were eager to erase what had been done. Only two men remained aboard, the captain and Elias Hale. Elias moved across the deck with excessive caution, like a man afraid of waking something that might still be sleeping. He followed simple orders, adjusted ropes, cleaned what little remained to be cleaned, and avoided looking at any place where bodies had fallen. He asked no questions and offered no opinions. His survival had never come from bravery, but from the lack of it, and now that truth was clearer than ever in the silence that stretched between him and the captain. Alaric watched the man with measured attention. There was no contempt in it, and no pity, only recognition. Elias had survived because he never placed himself at the center of anything, never tried to lead, never sought to decide. On a ship where decisions had become weapons, that had made him invisible, and invisibility had proven more effective than strength or conviction. In the days that followed, the captain kept the routine as though he still commanded a full crew. Watches were marked, tasks assigned, even when there were not enough hands to carry them out properly. It was a false discipline, but a necessary one. Without it, the silence would begin to speak too loudly. At night, Alaric stood on deck for hours, staring at the sea without truly seeing it. He no longer heard the creature's voice. He no longer felt its presence, and yet something lingered, like the memory of a weight removed by force. He knew it was not guilt or remorse in the usual sense. It was awareness, the certainty that, given the same conditions, he would make the same choices again. And that was what frightened him most. Elias tried to speak only once, days later, when the outline of a distant port began to rise on the horizon. He opened his mouth, closed it, and finally said only that the sails needed adjusting. Alaric nodded, and nothing more was said. Both of them understood that words there would neither explain nor ease anything. When the ship finally drew near the coast, there was no feeling of victory, only closure. The kind of closure that solves nothing, but marks where one thing ends and another begins. The port received the ship without ceremony. A few curious looks, a handful of vague questions, no real insistence. At sea, ships arrive undermanned all the time. Incomplete stories are part of the routine. Alaric answered only what was necessary, with short, imprecise sentences, letting other men's imaginations do the rest of the work. Elias Hale was the first to disembark. He stepped onto solid ground like a man testing a surface that might still give way beneath him. He did not look back. He did not offer thanks. He simply moved away, slowly, carrying with him a survival he did not seem to know how to justify. The captain remained aboard a while longer, watching unfamiliar men approach the ship, interested in work, in passage, in stories that had not yet been told. The sea remained there, indifferent, ready to take anyone willing to climb aboard. When Alaric finally stepped onto the dock, there were no farewells and no promises, only the certainty that this voyage had ended, and that the kind of man it had created would not stay far from the water for long. Months later, the ship sailed again, bearing a different name painted on the hull and new faces moving across the deck. None of them knew what had truly happened on that voyage. None of them needed to. The sea does not demand confessions, only continuity. Alaric Thorne continued to command. He continued to decide, not because he believed himself just or necessary, but because he had learned there would always be moments when someone must make the choice no one else is willing to carry. He no longer expected absolution or redemption. He expected only that when the moment came again, he would have the strength to do what was required. Somewhere far away, Elias Hale lived a quiet life, carrying a story he never told in full. He had survived by being small enough not to matter, and that knowledge stayed with him forever. The sea went on existing, as it always had, not as judge or executioner, but as the stage for human decisions, because monsters can be killed, but choices, those always find a way back to the surface.